The city feared the man. I feared the moment I realized he could still choose kindness. That was the sentence I kept hearing in my head every time someone asked how my life changed, because the truth sounded too impossible to believe. It started on a cold October evening beneath crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors at the Whitmore Foundation Charity Gala in Manhattan, a place where the wealthy smiled with perfect manners while pretending money could erase every secret they carried. I wasn't supposed to stand out. I was 26 years old, working my third catering shift that week to keep my mother's physical therapy appointments paid for, and my younger brother enrolled in community college. My black uniform had been ironed twice to hide how old it really was, and my shoes pinched every step across the ballroom, but I kept smiling because tips mattered more than comfort. Around me, politicians laughed beside CEOs, reporters chased headlines without asking questions, and diamonds reflected the warm golden light like tiny stars. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they belonged except me. Then the room changed. Conversations slowed before they stopped. Security personnel straightened almost in unison. Even the orchestra seemed quieter. Adrian Moretti had arrived. I had heard the name before, of course. Everyone in New York had. Some called him a billionaire investor. Others whispered darker stories they never repeated twice. No one raised their voice when speaking about him. He walked through the ballroom wearing a charcoal suit that looked perfectly tailored, his expression calm, unreadable, almost detached from the attention surrounding him. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. Somehow that made him even harder to ignore. Every person stepped aside without being asked. Every camera turned toward him. I lowered my eyes and focused on balancing a silver tray filled with champagne glasses. Powerful men existed in another universe, and I had no reason to enter it. Then everything went wrong. One of the city's most influential developers reached for a drink, deliberately bumped my shoulder, and laughed as several glasses crashed across the marble floor. The sharp sound echoed through the ballroom. Champagne splashed across my uniform. A dozen heads turned. The developer looked down at me with a grin that felt colder than the October wind outside. "Maybe stick to jobs you're qualified for," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. Laughter followed. My cheeks burned, but I bent down to collect the broken glass anyway because losing my temper meant losing my paycheck. Then another voice cut through the room. Calm. Low. Certain. "That's enough." I looked up. Adrian Moretti stood only a few feet away. His eyes weren't on the shattered glasses. They were on the man mocking me. Without raising his voice, Adrian asked him to apologize. The developer laughed again as if the request were a joke. My heartbeat pounded inside my ears. Adrian stepped closer, not threatening, not angry, simply waiting. For reasons I still don't fully understand, he reached toward me, perhaps to help me stand before anyone else noticed my shaking hands. In that single impossible second, every memory of being talked down to, dismissed, and treated like I didn't matter crashed together inside my chest. Pulled away. Before I could stop myself, I spat at his polished shoes and the front of his jacket. The ballroom froze. A crystal glass rolled across the marble floor until it finally settled into silence. Hundreds of eyes locked onto us. Someone gasped. Someone whispered a prayer. And every person in that room believed they had just witnessed the last mistake I would ever make. No one moved. The silence inside that ballroom weighed more than every chandelier hanging above our heads. I could hear my own breathing, uneven and embarrassingly loud, while a single drop of champagne slid from the edge of the silver tray onto the marble floor. The developer who had mocked me took one careful step backward. His confidence disappeared so quickly that it almost looked unreal. The security staff exchanged uncertain glances, waiting for instructions that never came. Adrian Moretti did not wipe his jacket. He did not look angry. He simply watched me with an expression I could not understand. His eyes held no amusement, no embarrassment, and certainly no hatred. That frightened me more than shouting ever could. I expected someone to grab my arm. I expected my manager to drag me outside before I could apologize. Instead, Adrian slowly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a folded white handkerchief. Every person nearby seemed to stop breathing. He calmly cleaned the front of his suit with deliberate movements before handing the handkerchief to one of his assistants. Then he looked directly at me. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly. I blinked because I was certain I had heard him wrong. Around us, dozens of guests stared without pretending otherwise. Cameras from several reporters remained lowered, almost as if they were afraid documenting this moment might somehow become a mistake. My manager hurried toward us, pale enough to look sick. "Mr. Moretti, I am so sorry. She has been under tremendous stress. Please allow me to handle this immediately." Adrian never looked away from me. I asked her a question. His voice remained calm, but the room instantly fell silent again. I swallowed hard. "No," I answered. "I am not hurt." He gave one almost invisible nod. "Good." That was all. Just one word. Then he turned toward my manager. "She finishes her shift tonight. No one deducts $1 from her paycheck. No one fires her because of this." My manager looked completely frozen. "Of course, sir." Adrian adjusted one cuff as though nothing unusual had happened. "And if anyone in this room believes humiliating employees is acceptable, they should reconsider where they spend their evenings." He walked away before anyone could answer. His security team followed without speaking. Within seconds, the most powerful man in the room disappeared into another reception hall, leaving behind hundreds of stunned witnesses who suddenly found their conversations impossible to restart. The developer who had laughed at me quietly collected his coat and left through a side exit without saying another word. My hands continued trembling as I picked up the remaining broken glass. Several guests approached to offer polite smiles that had not existed 10 minutes earlier. One woman slipped a folded $50 bill into my apron pocket without saying a word. Another whispered, "I have never seen him do that." Neither had anyone else. By the end of my shift, rumors had already spread through every hallway of the hotel. Some insisted Adrian had planned the entire scene. Others claimed he had finally become unpredictable. A dishwasher showed me 3 different social media posts describing the incident from completely different angles, each one more dramatic than the last. Yet none of them understood what haunted me most. It was not that I had publicly insulted the most feared man in the city. It was the look in his eyes after everyone expected revenge and he chose restraint instead. Somehow, that single decision followed me all the way home, lingering in the quiet corners of my tiny apartment long after the lights of Manhattan disappeared beyond my window. The next morning, I expected everything to fall apart. I expected my manager to call before sunrise and tell me never to come back. I expected strangers to be waiting outside my apartment. Instead, my alarm rang at 6:30. The coffee maker sputtered like it always did, and the city kept moving as though nothing extraordinary had happened. That almost unsettled me more. New York never ignored a scandal. By the time I reached the subway, 2 people were already talking about the gala. Neither recognized me standing only a few feet away. One insisted the mysterious waitress had been escorted out in handcuffs. Another claimed Adrian Moretti had secretly offered her a fortune. Both stories were wrong. I had finished my shift, collected my paycheck, and gone home with sore feet and a mind that refused to rest. At the rehabilitation clinic where I worked during the day, my friend Melissa leaned against the reception desk holding her phone. "Claire, you have to see this." My stomach tightened before I even looked. There were blurry photographs from the ballroom circulating online. Most had captured Adrian walking away. One image showed me standing frozen beside the shattered glasses. The comments underneath argued about everything except the truth. Some called me brave. Others called me reckless. None of them knew why I had reacted the way I did. None of them understood what it felt like to spend years swallowing every insult because speaking up always carried a price. I handed the phone back without saying a word. There were patients waiting, and unlike internet strangers, they actually needed me. Mrs. Donnelly smiled when I helped her practice climbing 3 small therapy steps. Mr. Alvarez celebrated taking 12 steady steps without his walker for the first time in months. Their victories mattered more than headlines. They reminded me who I was before one impossible evening threatened to define my entire life. Around lunchtime, my supervisor quietly called me into her office. She closed the door and folded her hands together. Claire, someone made a donation to the clinic this morning. I nodded politely, unsure why that involved me. The gift covers 6 months of treatment for patients who cannot afford physical therapy. She hesitated. The donor requested complete anonymity. Something inside me tightened anyway. Did they leave a name? She slowly shook her head. Only a handwritten note. She slid a small white envelope across the desk. My fingers hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single sentence written in neat black ink. Kindness should never become a financial burden. There was no signature, no company logo, nothing connecting it to anyone. Yet I somehow knew. I folded the note and slipped it back into the envelope. I cannot accept personal gifts, I said quietly. My supervisor looked confused. Claire, this is for the clinic, not for you. I forced a small smile, but my thoughts refused to settle. Whoever had sent that donation had watched closely enough to know exactly where I worked and exactly what mattered to me. That realization stayed with me all afternoon. When my shift ended, I stepped outside into the cool autumn air and looked across the busy street. A black sedan sat parked beside the curb. It did not move. Its windows were tinted too dark to see inside. After several long seconds, the traffic light turned green. The sedan merged smoothly into the evening traffic and disappeared without a sound, leaving me with the uncomfortable feeling that my ordinary life had quietly become part of someone else's story. For the next several days, I convinced myself I was imagining things. The black sedan never appeared in exactly the same place twice, yet somehow it always seemed to exist somewhere at the edge of my routine. Once it was parked across from the rehabilitation clinic while I helped an elderly patient into a taxi. Another afternoon it rolled slowly past the grocery store where I stretched every dollar by comparing prices aisle after aisle. It never followed too closely. It never crossed any obvious line. It simply appeared and disappeared like a quiet reminder that someone knew where I was. I refused to let fear decide how I lived. My mother noticed the tension before anyone else. She had always been able to read my face long before I spoke. While I adjusted the blanket over her legs after another physical therapy session, she reached for my hand. Claire, she asked gently, what happened at that gala? I looked away toward the apartment window where late afternoon sunlight painted the neighboring brick buildings gold. Nothing worth worrying about. She smiled with the kind of patience only mothers possess. Then why have you been checking the street every time a car slows down? I laughed softly, but it sounded forced even to me. Changing the subject was easier than explaining why the calm expression of a man I barely knew refused to leave my thoughts. It was not fear that lingered anymore. It was confusion. I had expected anger. Instead, he had answered humiliation with restraint. I had expected consequences. Instead, anonymous generosity had quietly reached a clinic full of strangers. None of it fit the stories people whispered about Adrian Moretti. 3 evenings later, I stayed late at the clinic organizing donated medical supplies after everyone else had gone home. The building had become wonderfully quiet. The only sounds were the steady hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of traffic drifting through the windows. I was locking a storage cabinet when someone knocked on the open office door. I turned, expecting another therapist. Instead, an older man in a navy suit stood politely in the hallway holding a simple white envelope. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his calm expression reminded me more of a retired professor than anyone connected to wealth or power. Miss Bennett? He asked. I nodded cautiously. My name is Thomas. I work for Mr. Moretti. My heartbeat immediately quickened. Before I could answer, he continued. Please do not worry. I am only here to deliver a message. He extended the envelope but did not step closer. I hesitated before accepting it. The paper felt unusually heavy despite containing only a single folded card. Mr. Moretti asked me to tell you that there are no obligations attached to this letter, Thomas said. He also instructed me to leave immediately after delivering it. He offered a respectful nod, turned, and quietly walked away without waiting for a response. I stood alone for several long moments before opening the envelope. Inside rested one handwritten sentence. I would rather earn your respect than receive your apology. There was nothing else. No invitation. No request. No signature beyond a single handwritten initial. I stared at those words until they blurred together. Then I carefully folded the note and slipped it back into the envelope, realizing for the first time that the most unexpected battle in my life might not be against a powerful man at all, but against every assumption I had ever made about him. I carried that envelope in my coat pocket for nearly a week before finally admitting I had memorized every word inside it. I never answered because I did not know how. Respect was not something people with power usually ask to earn. They expected it. They bought it. They demanded it. Yet somehow Adrian Moretti had chosen a different path, and that unsettled me more than any rumor ever could. Life, however, refused to pause for complicated emotions. My mother's next round of therapy required another payment. My brother Ethan needed new textbooks before midterms, and my landlord reminded me that rent would be due in 4 days. Every dollar already had a purpose before it even reached my bank account. That Friday evening, I picked up another catering shift at a corporate fundraising dinner on the Upper East Side. The ballroom was smaller than the charity gala but just as polished, filled with expensive watches, tailored suits, and conversations about investments that sounded like another language. I kept my head down and focused on serving coffee, determined to finish the night unnoticed. Halfway through dinner, the event coordinator hurried toward me carrying a small velvet box. "Claire, someone left this at the reception desk with your name on it." My stomach tightened immediately. I accepted the box but did not open it until I slipped into the empty service hallway. Inside rested a beautiful silver wristwatch with a simple white face, elegant without being flashy. Beneath it lay another handwritten card. "You are always running from one job to another. You deserve to know that your time matters." I closed the box so quickly that the sound echoed through the hallway. My pulse raced with equal parts frustration and disbelief. The gift was thoughtful. It was also impossible to accept. When my shift ended, I asked Thomas to meet me. He arrived 20 minutes later outside the hotel entrance, standing beside the same black sedan I had noticed more than once over the previous week. He greeted me with the same quiet professionalism. Before he could speak, I placed the velvet box into his hands. "Please return this to Mr. Moretti." Thomas looked genuinely surprised. "May I ask why?" I folded my arms against the cool autumn breeze. "Because if I keep accepting things I did not earn, eventually I will start believing I cannot stand on my own." Thomas studied me for a long moment before giving a respectful nod. "I will deliver your message exactly as you said it." I hesitated, then added one more sentence. "Tell him the clinic appreciated the donation. Tell him I appreciated the intention. But I cannot build my life on favors." Thomas smiled very slightly, the first real expression I had seen from him. "Miss Bennett, I believe that answer will interest him more than if you had accepted the gift." He returned to the car, and within moments the sedan disappeared into the stream of evening traffic. I stood alone beneath the glowing hotel lights, feeling strangely lighter. For the first time since that unforgettable night, I felt as though I had reclaimed a small part of my own story. I did not realize that somewhere across the city, Adrian Moretti would quietly read my message twice before setting the unopened watch aside and saying only one sentence to the people gathered around him. "For the first time in many years," he said calmly, "I have met someone who cannot be purchased." The following Tuesday began like every other long day. I left my apartment before sunrise with a travel mug of coffee that had already gone lukewarm by the time I reached the clinic. Patients filled every appointment on my schedule, and by late afternoon my feet ached so badly I considered taking the subway home instead of walking the last 6 blocks. Ordinary routines had become my greatest comfort because ordinary meant safe. That illusion lasted until 5:37. I had just stepped out of the clinic carrying a paper grocery bag when I noticed 2 unfamiliar men standing across the street. They were not dressed like businessmen or tourists. They were simply watching the entrance with the kind of quiet patience that immediately made me uneasy. The moment they realized I had noticed them, one smiled politely and began walking toward me. Every instinct told me to keep moving. I crossed the street before the light changed, blending into the evening crowd as office workers hurried toward Grand Central Terminal. When I glanced back, the two men had not followed immediately, but they had not left either. They simply watched. I told myself I was overreacting until I reached my apartment building and found my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Collins, waiting by the mailbox. She looked relieved when she saw me. "Claire, two gentlemen came by this afternoon asking whether you still lived here," she whispered. I told them I never answer questions about my neighbors. A chill ran through me. "Did they say who they were?" She slowly shook her head. "No. They were very polite, but something about them felt wrong." I thanked her and hurried upstairs, locking my apartment door behind me. Ethan was studying at the kitchen table while Mom rested on the couch. I smiled as naturally as I could, refusing to let either of them see the concern spreading through my thoughts. That evening my phone rang from an unknown number. I almost ignored it before finally answering. "Miss Bennett." I recognized Thomas's calm voice immediately. "I apologize for calling unexpectedly. How did you get my number?" I asked quietly. "Mr. Moretti instructed me to use it only if absolutely necessary." My grip tightened around the phone. "Necessary for what?" There was a brief silence. "Has anyone unusual approached you today?" My heartbeat quickened. I walked onto the fire escape so my family would not overhear. "Why are you asking me that?" Thomas answered carefully. "Because certain people have recently become interested in discovering why Mr. Moretti showed restraint at the gala. They believe there must be a reason. They believe that reason is you." I stared across the rooftops as the last orange light faded behind the Manhattan skyline. "I have nothing to do with his world," I whispered. "That is exactly what concerns him," Thomas replied. "People often misunderstand kindness. They mistake it for weakness. Mr. Moretti asked me to tell you one thing. Please do not change your routines out of fear. But if anything feels unusual, call this number immediately." Before I could respond, he ended the call. I remained on the fire escape for several minutes, listening to distant sirens and the endless rhythm of the city below. Then I noticed movement across the street. The same black sedan was parked beneath a streetlight. This time, however, it was not the only vehicle there. A dark gray SUV slowed as it passed my building, paused for several seconds, then continued toward the next corner. For the first time since all of this began, I realized the quiet attention surrounding me was no longer simply curiosity. Somewhere beyond my understanding, two different groups had started watching the same ordinary woman, and I had no idea why. Sleep became something I remembered instead of something I actually experienced. Every unexpected sound outside my apartment pulled me toward the window. Every unfamiliar face on the subway made me wonder whether I had seen them before. Still, I refused to let fear rewrite my life. The next morning I left for work at exactly 7:15, carrying the same worn canvas bag and the same lukewarm coffee that somehow tasted comforting simply because it belonged to my routine. The city moved with its usual relentless rhythm. Taxi horns echoed between buildings. Street vendors called out breakfast specials. Office workers hurried past without making eye contact. For a few precious minutes, everything felt normal again. Then my phone vibrated. It was not a call. It was a text from Thomas. "Please do not go directly to the clinic today. Walk into the bookstore on Lexington Avenue. Someone will meet you there." I stopped walking. Every reasonable instinct told me to ignore the message. Yet something about its simplicity convinced me otherwise. I turned toward the bookstore, stepped inside, and wandered between tall wooden shelves until I reached the history section. 5 minutes passed. Then another. Just as I began believing the message had been some elaborate mistake, a familiar voice spoke quietly from the opposite side of the shelf. "Thank you for trusting the note." I looked through the gap between two rows of books. Adrian Moretti stood alone wearing a dark wool coat instead of an expensive suit. There were no visible security guards. No crowd. No cameras. Just one man holding a hardcover biography, as though he had simply stopped in to browse on an ordinary Wednesday morning. I walked around the shelf until we faced each other. "You should not be here," I whispered. He gave the smallest smile. "Neither should you." I folded my arms. Thomas said people are watching me because of you. Adrian's expression grew serious. They are watching because they cannot understand why I made the decision I did. Then tell them the truth. His eyes met mine steadily. The truth is that I saw someone refuse to surrender her dignity, even when she believed it would cost her everything. I looked away, suddenly unable to hold his gaze. I was angry. You were honest, he replied. There is a difference. Before I could answer, the front door of the bookstore opened, and Adrian's attention shifted almost instantly toward the entrance. He did not appear frightened. He simply became alert in a way that made me realize how carefully he noticed the world around him. We should leave separately, he said calmly. Why? Because someone followed you here. My heartbeat stumbled. I resisted the urge to look toward the door. Adrian quietly placed the book back on the shelf. Claire, listen carefully. You have done nothing wrong. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise. His voice remained low and controlled. If anyone asks questions, answer only what you know. Do not guess. Do not assume. And above all, do not allow fear to make decisions on your behalf. I searched his face for some sign that this was all an exaggeration, but found only quiet certainty. Why are you helping me? I finally asked. He paused for several seconds before answering. Because the easiest thing in my world would have been to ignore you. I have spent enough years choosing what is easy. With that, he nodded once, walked toward a side exit, and disappeared into the morning crowd. I waited another minute before leaving through the front entrance. Across the street, I immediately noticed the dark gray SUV parked beside the curb. Its engine started the exact moment I stepped onto the sidewalk, and for the first time I understood that whatever had begun as an unexpected meeting inside a glittering ballroom had quietly become something much larger than either of us could simply walk away from. The days that followed settled into an uneasy balance. Nothing obvious happened, yet everything felt different. The dark gray SUV no longer appeared outside my apartment, but I caught unfamiliar faces lingering a little too long near the clinic and across the street from the grocery store. They never approached me. They simply watched, as if waiting for me to make a mistake. I refused to give them one. My family deserved a life untouched by whatever invisible conflict had begun around us. Then, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, the clinic received an invitation unlike anything we had ever seen. The Whitmore Foundation announced a citywide ceremony celebrating organizations that served low-income communities. Our rehabilitation clinic had been selected to receive its largest grant in history. My supervisor nearly cried when she read the letter aloud. The funding would replace outdated equipment, expand patient care, and allow dozens of families to continue treatment without worrying about bills. The entire staff insisted I attend because I had worked with so many of the patients benefiting from the program. I almost declined. Something inside me warned that this event was connected to Adrian. Curiosity eventually won. The ballroom looked strangely familiar. It was the very same hall where my life had changed only weeks earlier. The crystal chandeliers still reflected warm golden light across the polished marble floor. The orchestra played softly while community leaders, journalists, and donors filled every table. This time I wore the only navy blue dress I owned, borrowed from Melissa after she insisted it fit me better than it fit her. I kept reminding myself that I was there for the clinic, not for anyone else. When the master of ceremonies welcomed the audience, I noticed Adrian standing near the stage. He looked exactly as composed as the night we first met, yet something had changed. Instead of remaining surrounded by influential guests, he walked directly to the podium alone. The room gradually fell silent. He spoke about responsibility, opportunity, and the importance of investing in ordinary people whose quiet sacrifices often went unnoticed. Then he paused. His eyes moved across the audience until they found me. My heartbeat stopped. "Several weeks ago," he said calmly, "I met someone who reminded me that respect cannot be demanded. It must be deserved." A ripple of quiet curiosity spread through the ballroom. Adrian continued without looking away. She believed dignity was more valuable than comfort. She refused gifts she did not earn. She defended her independence even when accepting help would have been easier. I wanted the floor to open beneath me. Hundreds of people slowly turned toward my table. My face burned with embarrassment. Adrian lifted a small folder from the podium. Beginning today, the Moretti Community Partnership Fund will provide permanent financial support to rehabilitation clinics across New York City. The first advisory position has already been offered. My supervisor squeezed my hand beneath the table. Claire Bennett, Adrian said clearly. If you are willing, I would be honored to have you help ensure these resources reach the people who truly need them. The room erupted into applause before I could even process what had happened. Reporters raised cameras. Guests whispered to one another in astonishment. I remained frozen in my chair because I finally understood what had shocked everyone that evening. The most powerful man in the room had not tried to change me. Instead, he had changed the direction of his own influence, and somehow my refusal to surrender my principles had become the reason. The applause continued long after I stood up, but I barely heard it. My mind stayed fixed on the man waiting beside the podium with the same calm expression he had worn since the night our paths first crossed. I walked toward the stage slowly, aware that every camera in the ballroom had turned in my direction. When I reached him, Adrian extended his hand, not as a command, not as a performance, but as an invitation. This time I accepted it. His handshake was steady, respectful, and brief. No words were exchanged because none were needed in that moment. The audience saw a partnership. I understood it was something much simpler. It was mutual respect finally meeting in the middle. Over the following months, my life became busier than I had ever imagined. The new community fund helped rehabilitation clinics throughout New York replace aging equipment, expand therapy programs, and support families who had spent years choosing between medical care and rent. I continued working the same long hours because I never wanted to forget where I had started. Adrian kept his promise as well. He never tried to control the projects. He never asked me to favor one neighborhood over another. Whenever we disagreed, he listened first and answered second. It surprised everyone who knew him. Surprised me most of all. Reporters continued asking the same question every time they saw us together. They wanted to know how a waitress who had once publicly humiliated one of the most powerful men in the city had become his closest partner in a charitable mission. They expected scandal. They searched for hidden motives. The truth disappointed them because it was far less dramatic. One afternoon, during the opening of a newly renovated rehabilitation center in Brooklyn, a young nursing student approached me with tears in her eyes. She told me her father had finally received therapy after years of waiting because of the foundation's funding. She thanked me as though I had changed her family's future by myself. I smiled and gently corrected her. No, I said. One person chose to listen when pride would have been easier. Across the room, Adrian happened to hear those words. He did not interrupt. He simply smiled to himself before returning to a conversation with one of the therapists. Later that evening, as the last guests left and the sunset painted the city skyline in shades of gold and crimson, we stood quietly on the clinic rooftop overlooking Manhattan. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, Adrian broke the silence. "Do you ever regret that night?" he asked. I looked toward the streets far below where thousands of strangers hurried home without knowing our story. I thought about the fear, the misunderstandings, the sleepless nights, and every unexpected turn that had followed. Then I slowly shook my head. No, I answered honestly, because if I had acted any differently, neither of us would have become who we are today. He nodded as though he had already known my answer. The city lights flickered on one building after another, stretching toward the horizon like countless tiny promises. Looking back now, people still remember the moment that shocked an entire city. They remember the headlines, the whispers, and the impossible encounter that no one believed would end with compassion instead of revenge. What they rarely remember is the lesson hidden beneath it all. Power can force obedience for a season, but character earns trust for a lifetime. And sometimes the strongest person in the room is not the one everyone fears. It is the one who chooses respect when everyone else expects retaliation.